A lonely widower called James raised a lost boy named Daniel like his own son. On his 18th birthday, Daniel received a mysterious envelope with something shocking inside it from his biological father. What Daniel received would change his and James's life forever, finally being able to fulfill their dream. James walked slowly through the park, his footsteps heavy on the well-worn path. The evening air was cool, but he barely noticed it. His mind was lost in memories of happier times when his beloved wife had been by his side. He sighed, feeling the familiar ache in his chest. It had been 3 years since she passed, but the pain still felt fresh. The park bench where they used to sit together stood empty, a stark reminder of his loneliness. As he rounded a bend in the path, a faint sound caught his attention. James paused, tilting his head to listen. There it was again. A soft whimper, barely audible over the rustling leaves. Curious and concerned, James followed the sound. It led him off the path and towards a cluster of bushes. As he drew closer, the whimper grew into a plaintive cry. His heart raced as he pushed aside the branches. There, nestled in the grass, was a wicker basket. Inside, wrapped in a soft blue blanket, lay a tiny infant. James's breath caught in his throat. The baby's face was scrunched up, tears streaming down its chubby cheeks. Without hesitation, James knelt down and gently lifted the child into his arms. There, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. It's all right, little one. I've got you. The baby's cries softened as James cradled it close. He looked around, searching for any sign of the child's parents, but the park was deserted. There was no note, no explanation for why this precious life had been left alone. Tears welled up in James's eyes as he gazed down at the infant. In that moment, something shifted inside him. The emptiness that had been his constant companion for so long began to fade, replaced by a fierce protectiveness for this vulnerable child. "Don't you worry," James whispered, his voice trembling. "I'll take care of you. You're safe now." With the baby securely in his arms, James turned and hurried back towards the park entrance. His mind raced with questions and concerns, but one thing was certain. He couldn't leave this child alone. Whatever happened next, James knew his life would never be the same. James cradled the infant close to his chest as he hurried home, his heart pounding with a mix of worry and excitement. The tiny bundle in his arms stirred, letting out a soft whimper. James hushed the baby gently. "It's okay, little one, we're almost there." As he entered his modest house, the silence that usually greeted him was replaced by the baby's soft coos. James carefully placed the infant on his couch, surrounding him with pillows to keep him safe. He stepped back, running a hand through his graying hair as the reality of the situation sank in. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself. "I'm too old for this. I can't raise a child on my own." James paced the living room, stealing glances at the baby who was now contentedly sucking on his tiny fist. The responsibility of caring for an infant seemed overwhelming. He thought about his age, the sleepless nights ahead, and the challenges of being a single parent. But as he looked at the child's innocent face, James felt a warmth spreading through his chest. He remembered the love he and his wife had shared, and how they had always wanted children of their own. Maybe this was a second chance at that dream. "Daniel," James said softly, the name coming to him suddenly. "I think I'll call you Daniel." The baby, Daniel, gurgled in response, his big eyes fixed on James. In that moment, James's doubts began to fade. He knew he couldn't abandon this child, not when he had the ability to provide a loving home. "Okay, Daniel," James said, gently picking up the infant. "How about we take this one day at a time? I'll take care of you for now, and we'll figure out the rest as we go." As Daniel snuggled into his arms, James felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face it. James's life transformed overnight with Daniel's arrival. The quiet house now echoed with baby cries and coos, filling the once empty rooms with new life. James found himself fumbling through diaper changes and bottle feedings. his hands shaking slightly as he tried to remember the proper techniques. Sleepless nights became the norm as Daniel woke every few hours, hungry or needing comfort. James would stumble out of bed, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but his heart full of love for the tiny being who depended on him. "It's okay, buddy," James would murmur, cradling Daniel close as he paced the living room floor. "We're in this together." Despite the challenges, James found unexpected joy in the little moments. Daniel's first toothless smile made James's heart soar. The way Daniel's tiny hand wrapped around James's finger filled him with a sense of purpose he thought he'd lost forever. As days turned into weeks, James settled into a routine. He learned to anticipate Daniel's needs, his movements becoming more confident as he cared for the baby. The house, once a reminder of his loneliness, now felt warm and alive. James's neighbors couldn't help but notice the change in him. Mrs. Cruz, who lived next door, saw James in his yard one sunny afternoon. Daniel nestled in a baby carrier on his chest. "Well, look at you two," she called out, smiling. "James, I haven't seen you this happy in years." James felt his cheeks flush with pride. "This little guy has changed everything," he admitted, gently patting Daniel's back. As he chatted with Mrs. Cruz, James realized how much his life had shifted. The grief that had weighed him down for so long felt lighter now, replaced by the sweet burden of caring for Daniel. Though challenges lay ahead, James knew he had found a new purpose in life, one that filled his heart with hope and love. James took a deep breath as he stood outside the courthouse. Daniel nestled in his arms. Today was the day he would officially become Daniel's father. His heart raced with a mix of excitement and nervousness. Inside, James faced a sea of paperwork and questions from social workers and lawyers. They asked about his income, his health, and his ability to care for a child at his age. James answered each question with determination, his love for Daniel evident in every word. "Mr. Carlson," the judge said, peering over her glasses, "raising a child alone is a significant challenge. Are you certain you're prepared for this responsibility?" James looked down at Daniel, who gazed back with trusting eyes. "Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady. "I know it won't be easy, but Daniel has already brought so much joy into my life. I can't imagine not being there for him." The process was long and emotionally draining. James felt like his entire life was under a microscope, but when the judge finally declared Daniel officially his son, tears of joy streamed down James's face. As they left the courthouse, James's neighbors were waiting outside. Mrs. Cruz rushed forward, enveloping them both in a warm hug. "Congratulations, James," she exclaimed. "We're all so happy for you two." Mr. Johnson, from across the street, clapped James on the back. "You're a brave man, James. If you need any help, just holler." But not everyone was as supportive. James overheard Mrs. Peterson whispering to another neighbor, "At his age? How will he keep up with a toddler?" James felt a pang of doubt, but he pushed it aside. He knew there would be challenges, but he was ready to face them head on. That night, as James tucked Daniel into bed, he whispered, "We're officially a family now, little one. I promise to do my best every single day." James took a deep breath as he stood outside the Sunshine Daycare Center, holding Daniel's tiny hand. The colorful building seemed welcoming, but James couldn't help feeling a twinge of anxiety. This was a big step for both of them. As they entered, a warm-faced woman greeted them with a bright smile. "You must be James and Daniel. I'm Ms. Sarah, the lead teacher here." James nodded, his voice a bit shaky. "Nice to meet you, Ms. Sarah. It's our first day." Miss Sarah knelt down to Daniel's level. "Hello there, Daniel. We're going to have so much fun today." Daniel clung to James's leg, peeking out shyly. James gently patted his back. "It's okay, buddy. Remember what we talked about? You'll make new friends and play with lots of toys." Over the next few weeks, James found himself juggling his work schedule with drop-offs and pickups. It wasn't easy, but seeing Daniel's face light up when he talked about his day made it all worthwhile. One afternoon, as James arrived to pick up Daniel, he noticed another dad struggling with an armful of paperwork and a squirming toddler. Without hesitation, James stepped in to help. "Thanks, man," the dad said gratefully. "I'm Tom, by the way. Katie's dad. "James," he replied with a smile. "Daniel's dad." From that day on, James found himself part of an unexpected support network. He and Tom began swapping parenting tips and occasionally grabbing coffee after drop-off. Other parents joined in, and soon James had a whole group of friends who understood the joys and challenges of raising young children. At home, Daniel's laughter filled the once quiet rooms. James marveled at each new milestone. The first time Daniel sang the alphabet song, his wobbly first steps, the day he finally mastered using a spoon without spilling. One evening, as James tucked Daniel into bed, the little boy wrapped his arms around James's neck. "Love you, Daddy," he mumbled sleepily. James's heart swelled with joy. "I love you too, buddy," he whispered, realizing that his house had truly become a home again. James settled into a comfortable routine with Daniel, finding joy in the simple moments of everyday life. Each morning, he woke up to the sound of Daniel's giggles coming through the baby monitor. With a smile on his face, James would stretch and head to the nursery. "Good morning, little man," James would say, scooping Daniel up for a hug. The warmth of his son's tiny body against his chest never failed to fill James with a sense of purpose. After breakfast, they'd spend time playing on the living room floor. James marveled at how quickly Daniel was growing and learning. He'd watch in wonder as Daniel stacked blocks or babbled happily to his stuffed animals. "You're getting so big, buddy," James would often say, his voice full of pride. Lunchtime was always an adventure. James chuckled as he wiped pureed carrots off Daniel's chin, thinking about how much his life had changed. He wouldn't trade these messy moments for anything in the world. In the afternoons, they'd go for walks in the park or have play dates with other families from the daycare. James loved watching Daniel interact with other children, his heart swelling with pride at his son's kindness and curiosity. As evening approached, James would prepare dinner while Daniel played nearby in his high chair. The kitchen, once a lonely place, now echoed with Daniel's babbles and the clatter of pots and pans. Bedtime was James's favorite part of the day. He'd give Daniel a warm bath, dress him in soft pajamas, and settle into the rocking chair for a bedtime story. As he read, James would often pause to look at Daniel's sleepy face, marveling at the love he felt for this little boy. With Daniel tucked safely in his crib, James would often linger in the doorway, watching his son's peaceful breathing. In these quiet moments, he'd reflect on how much his life had changed since that fateful night in the park. "Thank you, Daniel," James whispered one night, his voice thick with emotion. "You've brought so much happiness into my life." James knew something was wrong the moment he heard Daniel's weak cries through the baby monitor. He rushed to the nursery, his heart pounding. Daniel's face was flushed, and his forehead felt hot to the touch. "Oh, buddy," James murmured, worry creasing his brow. He cradled Daniel close, feeling the heat radiating from his small body. As James took Daniel's temperature, his hands shook. The thermometer beeped, showing a high fever. Panic gripped James's heart, memories of his late wife's illness flooding back. It's okay," he whispered, trying to calm both Daniel and himself. But fear clawed at his throat as he dialed the pediatrician's office. The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and anxious moments. James barely left Daniel's side, giving him medicine and trying to keep him comfortable. Every time Daniel whimpered or coughed, James felt a stab of fear. One evening, as James rocked a feverish Daniel, he felt overwhelmed. Tears pricked his eyes as he remembered sitting by his wife's hospital bed. "I can't lose you too," he choked out, holding Daniel tighter. Just then, there was a soft knock at the door. James opened it to find his neighbor, Mrs. Cruz, holding a pot of soup. "I thought you might need this," she said gently. "How's our little guy doing?" James's voice cracked as he tried to respond. Mrs. Cruz's kindness broke through his walls, and he found himself pouring out his fears and worries. Soon, other neighbors and friends started showing up. They brought food, offered to run errands, and took turns sitting with James so he could rest. Their support wrapped around James like a warm blanket, easing some of his anxiety. As Daniel's fever finally broke, James felt a wave of relief wash over him. He looked around at the friends who had rallied around him, feeling deeply grateful. "Thank you all," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how I would have managed without you." Mrs. Cruz patted his arm. "That's what friends are for, dear. You're not alone in this." James nodded, realizing that even in his darkest moments, he had a community to lean on. With Daniel sleeping peacefully in his arms and friends by his side, James felt a glimmer of hope. They would get through this together. James watched with relief as Daniel's health improved day by day. The color returned to the boy's cheeks, and his laughter once again filled their home. As Daniel regained his strength, James felt a profound shift in his heart. One afternoon, as they sat in the living room, Daniel crawled into James's lap with a picture book. James wrapped his arms around the child, inhaling the sweet scent of his hair. In that moment, the depth of his love for Daniel hit him like a tidal wave. "I love you so much, buddy," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Daniel looked up at him with those big, trusting eyes. "Love you too, Daddy," he said, snuggling closer. James's heart swelled. He thought of the fear he'd felt when Daniel was sick, the sleepless nights, and the worry that had consumed him. But now, holding his son close, he knew it was all worth it. In that quiet moment, James made a silent vow. He promised to always protect Daniel, to nurture him, and to be the best father he could be. The responsibility no longer felt daunting. Instead, it filled him with purpose and joy. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the windows, James and Daniel remained cuddled together. James read the story, his voice soft and soothing. Daniel's eyelids grew heavy, and he yawned, nestling closer to James's chest. James closed the book and gently stroked Daniel's hair. "I think it's bedtime, little one," he murmured. Daniel nodded sleepily. "Stay with me, Daddy?" he asked, his voice small and drowsy. "Of course, buddy," James replied, his heart melting. "I'll always be here for you." He carried Daniel to his room and tucked him into bed. As James sat on the edge of the mattress, Daniel reached out and took his hand. The simple gesture spoke volumes, solidifying the bond between father and son. James watched as Daniel drifted off to sleep, his chest rising and falling peacefully. In the quiet of the room, James felt a sense of completeness he hadn't known since losing his wife. He realized that Daniel had not only filled a void in his life, but had given him a new purpose, a new love to cherish. James noticed Daniel's eyes light up every time they passed the toy store window. The little boy would press his face against the glass, pointing excitedly at a soft brown teddy bear with a red bow tie. James couldn't help but smile at Daniel's enthusiasm. One sunny afternoon, while Daniel was at daycare, James decided to surprise him. He entered the toy store, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully. The shopkeeper greeted him warmly as James made his way to the display. "That's the one," James said, pointing to the bear Daniel had admired. "I'd like to buy it for my son." The shopkeeper carefully took down the bear and handed it to James. As he held it, James marveled at how soft and cuddly it felt. He could already imagine Daniel's face lighting up when he saw it. That evening, as Daniel played with his blocks on the living room floor, James sat down beside him. "I have a surprise for you, buddy," he said, his eyes twinkling with excitement. Daniel looked up, curiosity written all over his face. James reached behind his back and pulled out the teddy bear. Daniel's eyes went wide, and a huge grin spread across his face. "For me?" he asked in awe, reaching out his little hands. James nodded, handing the bear to Daniel. "He needs a name. What do you think we should call him?" Daniel hugged the bear tightly, his face buried in its soft fur. After a moment of thought, he looked up at James. "Mr. Cuddles," he declared proudly. James chuckled. "Mr. Cuddles it is then." From that day on, Mr. Cuddles became Daniel's constant companion. The bear accompanied them on trips to the park, sat at the dinner table, and snuggled with Daniel during story time. James noticed how Daniel would hug Mr. Cuddles tight when he was feeling scared or upset, finding comfort in the soft toy. As the years passed, Mr. Cuddles remained a steadfast presence in Daniel's life. The bear's fur became a little worn, and his red bow tie faded, but Daniel's love for his cuddly friend never wavered. James often found himself smiling at the sight of Daniel fast asleep, Mr. Cuddles tucked securely under his arm. James sat in the audience, his heart pounding with excitement and nerves. He watched as Daniel, now 10 years old, walked onto the small stage of the community center. The boy's fingers fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, a telltale sign of his nervousness. James gave him an encouraging smile and a thumbs up. Daniel took a deep breath and sat down at the piano. For a moment, he closed his eyes, centering himself. Then, his fingers touched the keys, and the room filled with the most beautiful music James had ever heard. As the melody flowed, James felt tears prick at his eyes. He remembered the day he'd found Daniel, a tiny bundle left alone in the park. Now here was that same child creating something so wonderful. Pride swelled in James's chest, almost overwhelming him. The audience sat in rapt attention, many with misty eyes. James glanced around, seeing the impact Daniel's music was having on everyone. An elderly couple held hands, smiling softly. A young mother wiped away a tear, her own child watching Daniel with wide-eyed wonder. When the last note faded away, there was a moment of silence. Then, the room erupted in applause. Daniel stood up, his face flushed with a mix of relief and joy. He bowed shyly, his eyes seeking out James in the crowd. As Daniel made his way back to his seat, people reached out to pat his shoulder or whisper words of praise. James felt a lump in his throat, realizing how much Daniel had grown and how much he'd touched others with his talent. When Daniel finally reached him, James pulled him into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you, son," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Daniel hugged him back just as tightly. "Thanks, Dad," he said. "I couldn't have done it without you." In that moment, James felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. He'd taken a chance all those years ago, opening his heart and his home to this little boy. Now, seeing the amazing person Daniel was becoming, James knew it was the best decision he'd ever made. James watched Daniel from the doorway of his room, a bittersweet feeling tugging at his heart. His son was turning 18 soon, no longer the tiny baby he'd found in the park all those years ago. Daniel sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes of childhood mementos, a look of deep concentration on his face. "Need any help there, kiddo?" James asked, stepping into the room. Daniel looked up, a small smile playing on his lips. "I'm good, Dad. Just going through some old stuff." James nodded, noticing the slight hesitation in Daniel's voice. He'd sensed a change in his son lately, a growing curiosity that seemed to weigh on him. As James was about to leave, Daniel's voice stopped him. "Hey, Dad, look what I found." James turned to see Daniel holding up Mr. Cuddles, the stuffed bear that had been his constant companion throughout childhood. The sight of it brought a flood of memories. Nights spent soothing Daniel's nightmares, picnics in the park, and countless bedtime stories. "I can't believe you still have that old thing," James chuckled, moving closer to get a better look. Daniel turned the bear over in his hands, his fingers tracing the worn fabric. Suddenly he paused, his brow furrowing. "Dad, have you ever noticed this tag before?" James leaned in, curious. There, on the bear's back, was a small tag he'd never paid much attention to. It wasn't the usual care instructions, but something else entirely. Daniel's voice was quiet when he spoke again. "It has a name on it, and a date." He looked up at James, his eyes filled with a mix of emotions. "Dad, I think this might be from my birth parents." James felt his heart skip a beat. He'd always known this day might come, but he hadn't expected it to arrive so suddenly, brought on by a stuffed bear of all things. "Daniel," James began, his voice gentle, "if you want to know more about where you came from, I understand. It's natural to be curious." Daniel nodded, still clutching Mr. Cuddles. "I do, Dad, but I'm scared too. What if—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. James sat down next to his son, putting an arm around his shoulders. "Whatever you decide, whatever we find out, it doesn't change anything between us. You're my son, Daniel. Nothing will ever change that." James watched as Daniel carefully examined the tag on Mr. Cuddles. His heart raced, knowing this moment could change everything. He felt a mix of pride and worry as he observed his son's determined expression.
Wellington Toys, Daniel read aloud, his voice filled with curiosity. I've never heard of them before.
James leaned in closer, squinting at the small print. Looks like they're some kind of fancy toy company, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Maybe they make special bears or something. Daniel nodded, his eyes never leaving the tag. I want to find out more, Dad. Maybe they can tell us where Mr. Cuddles came from, and maybe even about my birth parents. James took a deep breath, pushing down the fear that threatened to rise up. He knew this day would come, but it still caught him off guard. Are you sure about this, kiddo? He asked gently. Daniel looked up at him, determination shining in his eyes. I am, Dad. I need to know. James nodded, giving Daniel's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. All right then, let's see what we can find out. They moved to the living room where Daniel pulled out his laptop. James watched as his son's fingers flew over the keyboard, searching for information about Wellington Toys. The minutes ticked by, filled with the soft tapping of keys and occasional murmurs of interest. Found it! Daniel exclaimed suddenly. They're still in business, Dad. And look, they have a contact form on their website. James peered at the screen, his heart pounding. This was it. The moment that could unlock the mystery of Daniel's past. He watched as Daniel began to type out a message, explaining about Mr. Cuddles and the tag. How's this sound, Dad? Daniel asked, turning the screen towards James. James read the message, feeling a lump form in his throat. It was polite, clear, and straight to the point. His son had grown into such a thoughtful young man. It's perfect, Daniel, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Are you ready to send it? Daniel hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the send button. He looked up at James, a mix of excitement and fear in his eyes. What if they don't respond? Or what if they do, and it leads to something big? James pulled Daniel into a hug, holding him tight. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. You're not alone in this, son. Not ever. Daniel nodded against James's shoulder, then pulled back with a determined smile. Okay, here goes nothing, he said, and clicked send. James stared at the email on Daniel's laptop screen, his heart pounding. Wellington Toys had responded, and their message was more than they could have hoped for. They were inviting Daniel and James to visit the company's headquarters. Dad, can you believe it? Daniel's voice quivered with excitement. They want us to come. James nodded, trying to keep his own emotions in check. It's amazing, son. But are you sure you're ready for this? Daniel's eyes met James's, filled with a mix of determination and uncertainty. I think so. I mean, I have to know, right? James pulled Daniel into a hug, feeling the trembling of his son's body against his own. He wished he could shield Daniel from whatever they might discover, but he knew this was a journey his son needed to take. We'll go together, James said softly, patting Daniel's back. Whatever we find out, we'll face it as a family. As they began to make plans for the trip, James found himself lost in thought. He watched Daniel bustling around, packing and repacking his bag, chattering excitedly about what they might learn. James's heart swelled with love, but also ached with a fear he couldn't quite shake. What if this led to Daniel's birth parents? What if they wanted to be part of his life? James tried to push away the selfish thoughts, reminding himself that this was about Daniel, not his own insecurities. That night, as James lay in bed, he found himself unable to sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with possibilities. What if the truth was painful? What if it changed everything? In the morning, James found Daniel sitting at the kitchen table, Mr. Cuddles clutched tightly in his arms. The sight reminded James of when Daniel was little, seeking comfort from his stuffed friend. You okay, kiddo? James asked gently, sitting down next to him. Daniel nodded, his eyes fixed on Mr. Cuddles. Just nervous, I guess. What if we don't find anything? Or what if we do, and it's not what I expected? James reached out, placing his hand over Daniel's. Whatever happens, we'll get through it together. You're my son, Daniel. Nothing will ever change that. James felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety as he and Daniel walked through the gleaming glass doors of Wellington Toys headquarters. The lobby was bright and cheerful, filled with displays of colorful toys and the sound of children's laughter from a play area in the corner. A friendly receptionist greeted them warmly and directed them to Mr. Thompson's office. As they rode the elevator, James noticed Daniel clutching Mr. Cuddles tightly to his chest, his knuckles white with tension. "It's going to be all right, son," James said softly, placing a reassuring hand on Daniel's shoulder. The elevator doors opened, revealing a spacious office with walls adorned with toy prototypes and framed photographs. Mr. Thompson, a tall man with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair, stood up from behind his desk to greet them. "Welcome, Daniel and James," Mr. Thompson said, shaking their hands. "I'm so glad you could make it. Please have a seat." As they settled into comfortable chairs, Mr. Thompson's gaze fell on Mr. Cuddles in Daniel's arms. A warm smile spread across his face. "Ah, I see you've brought a very special friend with you," he said, nodding towards the stuffed bear. Daniel looked down at Mr. Cuddles, then back at Mr. Thompson. "Yes, sir. He's been with me since I was a baby." Mr. Thompson leaned forward, his eyes twinkling. "Well, Daniel, you're holding a piece of Wellington Toys history. Mr. Cuddles was part of a very limited edition series, designed by our company's founder himself, Jonathan Wellington." James felt his heart skip a beat. He glanced at Daniel, who was hanging on every word. "Each toy in that series had a personal connection to Jonathan," Mr. Thompson continued. "He poured his heart into those designs, creating them for children who held a special place in his life." Daniel's grip on Mr. Cuddles loosened slightly as he looked at the toy with newfound wonder. "So, my Mr. Cuddles was made specially by the founder of Wellington Toys?" Mr. Thompson nodded, his expression softening. "Indeed he was. Jonathan had a way of making each toy feel like it had a little piece of his soul in it." James watched Daniel's face carefully as Mr. Thompson continued his story. The boy's eyes were wide with curiosity, and James could sense a growing excitement in him. "Jonathan Wellington was more than just a toy maker," Mr. Thompson explained, his voice filled with admiration. "He was a brilliant musician and a creative genius. His toys were inspired by his love for music and his desire to bring joy to children's lives." James noticed Daniel lean forward in his chair, hanging on every word. It was as if the story was awakening something within him. "Jonathan had a way of combining melodies with his toy designs," Mr. Thompson went on. "Each toy in that special series, including your Mr. Cuddles, was created with a specific song in mind." Daniel's fingers traced the worn fur of Mr. Cuddles, and James could almost see the wheels turning in his son's mind. The connection between Daniel's love for music and this revelation about Mr. Cuddles' creator wasn't lost on James. Mr. Thompson's expression turned somber. "Unfortunately, Jonathan disappeared years ago, under mysterious circumstances. It was a great loss to the company and to the world of toys and music." James felt a pang of sadness at these words, but it was nothing compared to the look on Daniel's face. The boy seemed deeply affected by the news, as if he had lost someone he knew personally. "What happened to him?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Thompson shook his head. "We don't know, I'm afraid. One day he was here, working on new designs and composing beautiful melodies. The next day, he was gone without a trace." James watched as Daniel hugged Mr. Cuddles closer to his chest, a mix of emotions playing across his face. There was sadness there, but also something else, a spark of curiosity and determination that James recognized all too well. "It's strange," Daniel said softly, looking down at his beloved toy. "I feel like I understand him somehow, like there's a connection between us." James placed a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder, feeling a surge of love and protectiveness. He could see that this story had touched something deep within his son, awakening questions and feelings that neither of them had anticipated. James felt his heart race as Mr. Thompson's words sank in. The revelation hit him like a tidal wave, and he instinctively tightened his grip on Daniel's shoulder. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Thompson nodded solemnly. "Our records show that Jonathan Wellington was Daniel's biological father. He left behind a substantial fortune for his son, along with a letter explaining everything." James looked at Daniel, whose face had gone pale. The boy clutched Mr. Cuddles tightly, his knuckles turning white. "There's more," Mr. Thompson continued gently. "Jonathan designed Mr. Cuddles specifically for Daniel. It was meant to be a symbol of his love, a way to be with his son, even when he couldn't be there in person." James felt a lump form in his throat. He watched as Daniel's eyes filled with tears, a mix of confusion and emotion swirling in their depths. "But why?" Daniel's voice cracked as he spoke. "Why did he leave me?" James pulled Daniel close, wrapping his arm around the boy's shoulders. He felt a surge of protectiveness, mixed with a twinge of fear. Would this change everything? Would Daniel still see him as his father? Mr. Thompson handed James a sealed envelope. "This letter from Jonathan might answer some of your questions." He wanted Daniel to have it when the time was right. With trembling hands, James took the envelope. He looked at Daniel, silently asking for permission. The boy nodded, and James carefully opened it. As James read the letter aloud, his voice thick with emotion, the story of Jonathan Wellington unfolded. The talented musician and toy maker had found himself in a dangerous situation, one that threatened the safety of his infant son. In a heart-wrenching decision, Jonathan had chosen to leave Daniel in a safe place, hoping that someone kind would find him and give him the love and security he deserved. James watched Daniel's face intently as he finished reading the letter. The boy's eyes were wide, filled with a storm of emotions. James's heart ached for his son, knowing how overwhelming this revelation must be. "Dad," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling, "I don't understand. He left me all this money, but he abandoned me." James pulled Daniel closer, feeling the boy's body shake with silent sobs. "Oh, Danny," he said softly, using the nickname he'd given Daniel when he was small. "Your father loved you very much. He was trying to protect you." Daniel looked up at James, his eyes searching for answers. "But why couldn't he keep me safe himself? Why did he have to leave me?" James took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes life puts us in impossible situations. Your father made a choice that must have torn him apart inside. He wanted you to have a chance at a happy, safe life." Daniel clutched Mr. Cuddles tightly, burying his face in the soft fur. "But what about all this money? It feels wrong." James gently stroked Daniel's hair, his touch full of love and reassurance. "Your father wanted to make sure you were taken care of, even if he couldn't be there himself. It doesn't change who you are, Danny. It doesn't change how much I love you." Daniel looked up at James, his eyes brimming with tears. "You're my real dad, James. You've always been there for me." James felt his own eyes well up. He pulled Daniel into a tight hug, feeling the boy's warmth against his chest. "And I always will be, son. Nothing will ever change that." As they held each other, James could feel Daniel's tension slowly easing. He knew there would be more questions, more emotions to work through. But for now, he wanted Daniel to know that he was loved, unconditionally and completely. "Your father's love was genuine, Danny," James said softly. "He made an impossible choice, but he did it out of love for you. And look at the beautiful life you've had, the music you create, the joy you bring to others. That's your father's legacy living on through you." James watched as Daniel's eyes lit up with a newfound purpose. The weight of his inheritance had been heavy on the boy's shoulders, but now a spark of inspiration seemed to ignite within him. "Dad," Daniel said, his voice filled with excitement, "I think I know what I want to do with the money." James leaned forward, his heart swelling with pride at the thoughtful look on his son's face. "What's on your mind, Danny?" Daniel took a deep breath. "I want to use it to help other kids like me, kids who might not have had the chance I did." James nodded encouragingly, feeling a lump form in his throat. "That's a wonderful idea, son. Your father would be proud." They sat together at the kitchen table, brainstorming ideas. James watched as Daniel scribbled notes, his brow furrowed in concentration. It reminded him of all the times they'd sat here doing homework together. "What about the old orphanage?" James suggested gently. "The one where you stayed briefly before I found you?" Daniel's eyes widened. That's perfect, Dad. We could fix it up and turn it into a music school. James felt his heart swell with love and pride. A music school for underprivileged children, he said softly. Danny, that's a beautiful idea. Daniel's face lit up with excitement. We could give kids a chance to learn music even if they can't afford lessons. It would be a way to honor my biological father's love of music and your love for me. James reached across the table and squeezed Daniel's hand. I think it's a wonderful way to create something positive out of your inheritance, your father's legacy, and your talent coming together to help others. As they continued to discuss the details, James marveled at the young man his son had become. Daniel's compassion and desire to help others touched him deeply. He knew that whatever challenges lay ahead in bringing this dream to life, they would face them together. James watched with a mixture of pride and awe as the old orphanage began its transformation. The once dilapidated building was slowly coming to life, its walls echoing with the sounds of hammers and saws. He couldn't help but feel a lump in his throat as he saw Daniel directing volunteers, his face beaming with purpose. We'll put the piano room here, Daniel explained to a group of workers, pointing to a large space near the entrance. I want it to be the first thing kids see when they come in. James nodded approvingly, remembering how music had been Daniel's lifeline during tough times. He turned his attention to a group of local moms who were busy painting colorful murals on the walls. Their brushes danced across the surface, bringing scenes of musical notes and instruments to life. As the days passed, James was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support from the community. Local businesses donated materials, retired teachers offered their services, and families brought home-cooked meals for the workers. It was as if the entire town had rallied behind Daniel's vision. One afternoon, as James was taking a break from painting, he overheard two volunteers talking. You know, I never thought I'd see this old place looking so hopeful, one of them said, wiping sweat from his brow. It's like the whole building is getting a second chance, the other replied, just like the kids who'll be learning here. James felt his eyes well up with tears. He looked over at Daniel, who was laughing with a group of children who had come to help plant flowers in the front yard. The joy on his son's face was unmistakable, and James knew that this project was healing something in Daniel too. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the renovated building, James couldn't help but feel that they were part of something much bigger than themselves. The orphanage, once a symbol of abandonment, was becoming a beacon of hope and new beginnings. James felt his heart sink as he looked at the latest budget report. The renovation costs had skyrocketed, far beyond what they had initially planned. He sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. How were they going to tell the volunteers and supporters that they might have to scale back their plans? Dad? Daniel's voice called from the doorway. Is everything okay? James looked up, seeing the concern in his son's eyes. He couldn't bear to dampen Daniel's enthusiasm, but he knew they had to face this challenge together. We've hit a bit of a snag, son, James said gently. The costs are higher than we expected. Daniel's face fell for a moment, but then a determined look crossed his features. We'll figure it out, Dad. We always do. James felt a surge of pride at Daniel's resilience. Together, they brainstormed ideas to cut costs and raise more funds. They organized bake sales, car washes, and even a community talent show. James was touched by how their neighbors and friends rallied around them, offering whatever help they could. But just as they thought they were getting back on track, another setback hit. Heavy rains caused flooding in the basement, delaying construction for weeks. James watched as Daniel's shoulders slumped at the news. Maybe this is all too much, Daniel said softly one evening, staring at the muddy puddles around the building's foundation. James put a comforting arm around his son. Remember what you told me when we started this? That every kid deserves a chance to find their passion, just like you did with music. Daniel nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Well, James continued, sometimes the most worthwhile things in life are the hardest to achieve. But we're not alone in this, Daniel. Look around. As if on cue, a group of volunteers arrived, armed with mops and buckets to help clean up the flooded basement. James saw the spark reignite in Daniel's eyes as they joined the cleanup effort. Through it all, James marveled at the strength of their bond. Every obstacle seemed to bring them closer, their shared dream keeping them going when things got tough. And with each challenge overcome, James knew they were building something far more precious than just a music school. They were creating a legacy of love, hope, and perseverance. James stood in the newly renovated music school, his eyes taking in the freshly painted walls and gleaming instruments. The opening day was just around the corner, and he couldn't help but feel a swell of pride and emotion. As he ran his hand along a polished piano, James's mind drifted back to that fateful night in the park. He could still hear the faint cries that led him to the basket where Daniel lay, tiny and helpless. A lump formed in his throat as he remembered how scared he'd been, wondering if he could really raise a child on his own. "Dad?" Daniel's voice broke through his reverie. "What are you thinking about?" James turned to see his son, now a young man standing in the doorway. He smiled warmly. "Just remembering the day I found you, son. It feels like yesterday, and a lifetime ago all at once." Daniel crossed the room and stood beside him, both of them gazing out the window at the playground they'd built for the students. "I was thinking about that too," Daniel said softly, "about how far we've come." James nodded, his heart full. "We've had our share of challenges, haven't we? But look at what we've created together." They reminisced about the sleepless nights when Daniel was a baby, the first time Daniel played the piano, and the countless obstacles they'd faced in bringing this school to life. James chuckled as he recalled Daniel's first recital and how nervous they both had been. "You know," James said, his voice thick with emotion, "I was so worried about failing you back then. But you've brought so much joy and purpose to my life, Daniel. I couldn't be prouder of the man you've become." Daniel's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I couldn't have asked for a better father, Dad. You've taught me so much about love, perseverance, and giving back." As they stood there, surrounded by the fruits of their labor, James felt a deep sense of gratitude. Every hardship, every moment of doubt had led them here. They had built more than just a music school. They had created a testament to the power of love and second chances. James stood in the foyer of the newly completed music school, his heart swelling with pride and anticipation. The grand opening was just hours away, and he couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. He watched as Daniel flitted about, making last-minute adjustments to decorations and checking that everything was perfect. "Son," James called out, his voice filled with warmth. "Come here for a moment." Daniel paused his fussing and walked over to his father, a mixture of excitement and nerves evident on his face. James placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Look at what we've accomplished," James said, gesturing around them. "This school is going to change so many lives." Daniel nodded, his eyes shining. "I just hope everything goes well today." James chuckled softly. "It will, son. We've got the whole community behind us." As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. James opened it to find Mrs. Thompson from next door, her arms laden with homemade treats for the celebration. "Oh, James," she exclaimed, stepping inside. "It looks absolutely wonderful in here." More neighbors and friends began to arrive, each bringing something to contribute to the grand opening. James felt overwhelmed by their generosity and support. He remembered how some of these same people had initially doubted his ability to raise Daniel alone, and now here they were, celebrating this incredible achievement with them. As the time for the ceremony approached, James found himself greeting familiar faces from every stage of their journey. There was Mr. Thompson from Wellington Toys, beaming with pride at how Daniel had used his inheritance. The daycare staff who had been there in those early days arrived, marveling at how much Daniel had grown. James's eyes misted over as he saw old Mrs. Jenkins hobble in with her walker. She had been one of the first to offer help when he'd brought Daniel home, always ready with a casserole or a kind word when he felt overwhelmed. "Mrs. Jenkins," James said, helping her to a comfortable seat, "I'm so glad you could make it." She patted his hand affectionately. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world, dear. You've done a wonderful thing here." As the room filled with chatter and laughter, James caught Daniel's eye across the room. They shared a smile, both feeling the weight of the moment. This school was more than just a building. It was a symbol of their journey together, of the love and perseverance that had brought them to this point. James stood at the back of the auditorium, his heart swelling with pride as he watched Daniel take his place at the grand piano on stage. The room fell silent, all eyes on the young man who had touched so many lives. Daniel cleared his throat and spoke into the microphone, his voice clear and steady. "This piece is dedicated to two fathers, the one who gave me life and the one who gave me a home. Dad, this is for you." As Daniel's fingers touched the keys, James felt a lump form in his throat. The melody that filled the air was hauntingly beautiful, full of emotion and depth. James recognized bits and pieces of tunes he'd heard Daniel practicing over the years, woven together into something entirely new and breathtaking. James glanced around the room, seeing tears glistening in the eyes of their friends and neighbors. Mrs. Jenkins dabbed at her cheeks with a handkerchief, while Mr. Thompson from Wellington Toys nodded along, a wistful smile on his face. The music swelled, and James felt as if his heart might burst. He thought of all the late nights, the scraped knees, the homework struggles, and the triumphs big and small that had led to this moment. He remembered the tiny baby he'd found in the park, and marveled at the talented, compassionate young man Daniel had become. As the final notes faded away, there was a moment of hushed silence before the room erupted in applause. James wiped his eyes, not bothering to hide his tears. Daniel stood and bowed, his gaze finding James in the crowd. Their eyes met, and in that moment no words were needed. People began to stand, the applause growing louder. James saw Mrs. Thompson from next door openly weeping, her husband's arm around her shoulders. Even old Mr. Grumpy from down the street, who'd always complained about Daniel's piano practice, was on his feet, clapping enthusiastically. James felt a hand on his arm and turned to see Mrs. Jenkins beside him. "You've done good, James," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That boy is a blessing, and so are you." James nodded, unable to speak. He felt a profound sense of fulfillment, knowing that he and Daniel had created something truly special. This music school would change lives, just as Daniel had changed his. As he watched his son take another bow, James knew that this was only the beginning of a beautiful legacy. James took a deep breath as he stepped up to the microphone. His hands trembled slightly, but his heart was full of love and gratitude. He looked out at the sea of familiar faces, people who had been there for him and Daniel through thick and thin. "Friends, neighbors, honored guests," James began, his voice warm and sincere. "I stand before you today with a heart overflowing with thankfulness. When I found Daniel in the park all those years ago, I never imagined we'd be here opening a music school that will change so many lives." He paused, his eyes misting over as he recalled that fateful night. "I was a lonely widower, lost and adrift. But Daniel gave me purpose, and all of you gave us support. Every diaper changed, every sleepless night, every triumph and setback. You were there cheering us on." James's gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of those who had been part of their journey. "Mrs. Jenkins, who taught me how to warm a bottle properly. Mr. Thompson, who helped us uncover Daniel's past, and every single one of you who believed in us even when I doubted myself." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "This school is more than just a building. It's a testament to what love can do. Love found me in a park, bundled up in a basket. Love gave me the strength to become a father when I thought those days were behind me. And love brought all of you into our lives, creating a community that lifted us up when we needed it most." James smiled, his eyes shining. "To the children who will learn and grow within these walls, I say this: never underestimate the power of kindness and perseverance. Your journey may not be easy, but with love and support you can overcome any obstacle." He looked at Daniel, who beamed back at him from the front row. "And to my son, Daniel, you've taught me more than I could ever teach you. Your courage, your talent, and your big heart inspire me every day. I'm so proud to be your dad." James watched with pride as Daniel moved from student to student, his gentle guidance filling the music room with soft melodies and encouraging words. The once abandoned infant had grown into a compassionate young man, and James's heart swelled with love and admiration. That's it, Emily, Daniel said softly to a young girl struggling with a difficult piano piece. Remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about feeling the music in your heart. James smiled, remembering the countless hours he had spent with Daniel, nurturing his love for music. Now, Daniel was passing on that same passion and patience to these children, many of whom came from challenging backgrounds. As James walked through the halls of the school, he stopped to admire the colorful artwork adorning the walls, each piece a testament to the creativity and resilience of the students. He paused to chat with a group of children practicing their scales, offering words of encouragement and praise. "Mr. James," a small boy called out, his eyes shining with excitement. "I learned a whole new song today." James knelt down to the boy's level, his face lighting up with genuine interest. "That's wonderful, Tommy. I can't wait to hear it at the next recital." Later that afternoon, James sat in on one of Daniel's classes. He watched as his son shared not just musical knowledge, but life lessons as well. "Music is a lot like life," Daniel told his students. "Sometimes it's hard, and you might want to give up. But if you keep practicing and believing in yourself, you can create something beautiful." James felt a lump form in his throat. Daniel's words echoed the very lessons he had tried to instill in his son over the years. As the class ended and the children filed out, James approached Daniel. "You're doing an amazing job, son," James said, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "These kids are lucky to have you as a teacher." Daniel smiled, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I learned it from the best, Dad. Everything I know about perseverance and following your passion, I learned it from you." James sat at the kitchen table, a stack of letters and cards spread out before him. His eyes misted over as he read through the heartfelt messages from families whose lives had been touched by the music school. Daniel walked in, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "More mail came today, Dad," Daniel said, setting a mug in front of James. "I can't believe how many people have reached out." James nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He picked up a colorful card covered in crayon drawings. "Listen to this one," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "Dear Mr. James and Mr. Daniel, I never thought I could play music before. Now I can play 3 whole songs on the piano. Thank you for giving me a chance to learn. Love, Sarah." Daniel smiled, his eyes shining. "That's Sarah from Mrs. Castro's class. She's come so far in just a few months." James reached for another letter, this one written in a shaky hand. "This is from an elderly gentleman named George. He says his granddaughter attends our school and it's given her a new lease on life after losing her parents." As they went through the pile, James felt a warmth spreading through his chest. Each story was a testament to the impact they were making, not just teaching music, but offering hope and healing to those who needed it most. "You know, son," James said, looking up at Daniel, "I think your father would be proud of what we've accomplished here. His legacy lives on through every child who walks through those doors." Daniel nodded, his eyes misty. "I wish I could have known him, but in a way, I feel like I do. Through the music and through the joy we're bringing to these families." James reached out and squeezed Daniel's hand. "Your father's love for you started all of this. And now, look at how far that love has spread." They continued reading, their hearts full of gratitude and purpose. Each letter reaffirmed the importance of their mission and the profound difference they were making in their community. James watched with pride as Daniel led a group of children through their holiday concert rehearsal. The music school's main hall was festooned with twinkling lights and colorful decorations, filling the air with a sense of joy and anticipation. As the last notes faded away, James clapped enthusiastically. "Wonderful job, everyone," he called out. The children beamed, their faces glowing with accomplishment. Daniel turned to his father, a wide smile on his face. "What do you think, Dad? Are we ready for the big show?" James nodded, his heart swelling with love and pride. "More than ready, son. You've done an amazing job with them." Later that evening, as they locked up the school, James couldn't help but marvel at how far they'd come. What had started as a dream born from tragedy had blossomed into something truly beautiful. "You know, James said as they walked to their car. "I never imagined we'd be creating new traditions like this. It's like we've gained a whole new family." Daniel nodded, his eyes shining. "I was just thinking the same thing. Remember our first Thanksgiving after you adopted me? It was just the two of us and a slightly burnt turkey." James chuckled at the memory. "And now look at us. We're hosting a feast for the entire school next week." As they drove home, James reflected on the other milestones they'd celebrated with their extended school family. There was the summer picnic, where they'd surprised one of their students with a scholarship to music camp, and the impromptu party they'd thrown when little Tommy finally mastered Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star after months of trying. Each memory was a thread in the tapestry of their new life, woven together with love, music, and the joy of shared accomplishments. James glanced at Daniel, feeling a surge of gratitude for the unexpected gift that had changed his life so profoundly. "I'm so proud of you, son," James said softly, "of everything we've built together." Daniel reached over and squeezed his father's shoulder. "I couldn't have done any of it without you, Dad. You've always been my rock." As they pulled into their driveway, James felt a sense of contentment wash over him. Their house might be quiet, but their lives were filled with the music of laughter, love, and the sweet melodies of children finding their voices. James couldn't believe his eyes as he read the letter in his hands. The local government had chosen their music school for a special community award. His heart swelled with pride as he looked up at Daniel, who was busy arranging sheet music for his next class. "Daniel, come here for a moment," James called out, his voice trembling with excitement. "You won't believe this." Daniel hurried over, curiosity written all over his face. As James shared the news, Daniel's eyes widened in surprise and joy. "Dad, this is amazing," Daniel exclaimed, pulling James into a tight hug. "All our hard work is really paying off." James nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "It sure is, son. And there's more. They want us to speak at the award ceremony, to share our story." In the weeks that followed, James found himself thrust into a whirlwind of activity. The school began receiving visits from local officials and representatives from various charitable organizations. Each visitor left with a smile on their face and a promise to spread the word about the wonderful work being done. James watched with pride as Daniel confidently led tours of the school, his passion for music and teaching shining through in every word. The young man he had raised was truly coming into his own, and James couldn't have been happier. As the day of the award ceremony approached, James felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. He had never been one for public speaking, but the thought of sharing their story and potentially inspiring others filled him with determination. Standing at the podium with Daniel by his side, James took a deep breath and began to speak. He told the audience about finding Daniel as a baby, about the challenges and joys of single parenthood, and about the unexpected gift of Jonathan Wellington's legacy. As he spoke, he could see people in the audience wiping away tears and nodding in understanding. "Our music school isn't just about teaching notes and rhythms," James said, his voice strong and clear. "It's about giving children a chance to find their voice, to express themselves, and to believe in their own potential. And in doing so, we've created a community that supports and uplifts one another." James stood beside Daniel, his heart swelling with pride as they watched the children playing music in the school's main hall. The joyful sounds of violins, pianos, and flutes filled the air, creating a symphony of hope and possibility. James couldn't help but smile as he saw the concentration on the young faces, their fingers moving deftly over instruments that were once just dreams to them. He glanced at Daniel, noticing the look of contentment on his son's face. It was a mirror of his own feelings. Together, they had built something truly special, a place where children could discover their talents and find their voices through music. "Look at them, Dad," Daniel whispered, his eyes shining with emotion. "Remember when we first started? And now?" James nodded, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "I know, son. It's more than I ever could have imagined." As they watched, a young girl who had been struggling with a difficult piece finally mastered it. Her face lit up with joy, and she turned to her teacher with a beaming smile. James felt a lump form in his throat, remembering all the challenges they had faced to get to this point. "We did good, didn't we?" James said softly, his voice filled with emotion. Daniel turned to him, his eyes brimming with tears of happiness. "We did, Dad. We really did." They stood there in comfortable silence, basking in the warmth of their shared accomplishment. James thought about the journey that had brought them here, from that fateful night in the park to this moment of pure joy. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought Daniel into his life and led them to create this beautiful legacy. As the music swelled around them, James and Daniel exchanged a look of understanding. They had built something that would outlast them, something that would continue to bring joy and opportunity to children for years to come. In that moment, James felt a profound sense of peace and fulfillment, knowing that their hard work and love had created something truly meaningful and lasting. James walked alongside Daniel through the familiar paths of the park, the same park where their journey had begun all those years ago. The evening air was crisp, and the setting sun painted the sky in warm hues of orange and pink. James felt a wave of nostalgia wash over him as they approached the spot where he had found Daniel as an infant. "It's hard to believe it all started right here," James said softly, his eyes misting over with emotion. Daniel nodded, his hand resting gently on James's arm. "I can't imagine how different my life would be if you hadn't found me that night." James looked at his son, marveling at the man he had become. The shy, curious boy had grown into a compassionate, talented adult who touched countless lives through their music school. James's heart swelled with pride and love. "You know, son," James began, his voice thick with emotion, "I thought I was saving you that night. But the truth is, you saved me too." They paused at the bench where James had first held Daniel in his arms. Sitting down, they gazed out at the park, watching families stroll by and children playing on the nearby playground. "Dad," Daniel said, turning to James with a smile, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd made a different choice that night?" James shook his head, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Not for a second. Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. And look at all the good that's come from it. The music school, the children we've helped." Daniel squeezed his father's hand. "We've built something amazing, haven't we?" James nodded, his eyes shining with pride and joy. "We certainly have, son. And the best part is, it's only the beginning. Just think of all the lives we'll touch in the years to come." As they sat there, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of the park, James felt a deep sense of contentment. Their journey had been filled with challenges and triumphs, laughter and tears, but every step had led them to this moment. And as he looked towards the future, James knew that the best was yet to come. Would you do the same thing as James and raise an abandoned child if you found one? Yes or no? Let me know in the